On the night of July 17, 1944, the Sacramento River Delta north of San Francisco was lit by a detonation so massive that its light reached San Francisco 35 miles away. Windows shattered in towns 20 miles from the source. The blast wave traveled outward across the flat delta landscape and into the surrounding communities, and people came out of their houses and looked toward the sky and saw what looked, from that distance, like the sky itself on fire. At Port Chicago Naval Ammunition Depot, 2 transport vessels had been loading munitions for the Pacific Theater. Hundreds of men were at work on the docks. In an instant, both ships, the loading pier, and everyone on them were gone. 320 American sailors died in the explosion. It remains the worst home front disaster of the Second World War. The majority of the men who died that night were black. This is the beginning of a story that the United States Navy spent years trying to suppress, that the NAACP spent years trying to make public, and that the men at the center of it carried for the rest of their lives, not as trauma in the private sense, though it was certainly that, but as an experience that illustrated something essential about the nature of the society they had been called to defend. To understand Port Chicago, it is necessary to understand what the United States Navy looked like in 1943 and 1944. The military in those years was segregated by law and by institutional practice. Black servicemen were not admitted to the same units, the same facilities, the same opportunities as white servicemen. The official justification, and there were always official justifications, presented with the full weight of institutional authority, was that segregation was necessary for military efficiency, that integrated units would produce friction and reduce combat effectiveness, that the social arrangements of the civilian world should be replicated within the armed forces. The practical consequence was a tiered system in which black servicemen were concentrated in support roles, labor battalions, stevedore units, quartermaster companies, the unglamorous but essential work of moving and handling the material that a modern military requires in enormous quantities. They built the roads, loaded the ships, drove the trucks, operated the depots. They did this work under white officers, supervised by white petty officers, in facilities that were segregated down to the recreational amenities. Port Chicago was this system in a specific and particularly hazardous form. The Naval Ammunition Depot on the Sacramento River was the facility through which a significant portion of the munitions destined for the Pacific Theater was loaded onto ships. The men who handled this work, the ammunition loaders who transferred shells, bombs, and explosives from rail cars onto the waiting vessels, were virtually all black enlisted men. Their officers were white. The officer corps had no training in explosives handling and no particular expertise in the work they were supervising. The men they supervised had no formal training in ammunition handling either. They had been sent to the depot and put to work with minimal preparation for one of the most technically demanding and physically dangerous tasks in the American war effort. The competitive dimension of the work made its danger worse. The commanding officers at Port Chicago had organized the loading operations as a competition between divisions, a tournament of tonnage, in which the goal was to move more material more quickly than the other units. Officers bet on which division would load the most ammunition in a given shift. The winnings were trivial. The pressure created by the competition was not. Men worked faster than safety warranted. Shells were handled with less care than the specifications required. The men on the docks knew that what they were doing was dangerous under any conditions and that the competitive pressure was making it more dangerous. They said so. They complained to supervisors, wrote letters, raised the issue in whatever ways were available to them. The institutional response, when there was one, was to tell them that the explosives could not detonate without detonators and that their concerns were unfounded. They did not believe this. They had no reason to believe it, because the evidence before them, the casual handling of materials that the manuals specified should be treated with extreme care, the pressure to move faster, the absence of any serious safety training, contradicted the assurance. But they were sailors, under military authority, in wartime. The options available to them for refusing or resisting the work were limited, and the consequences of using those options were severe. Joseph Small was one of the black ammunition loaders at Port Chicago. He was not, by any official measure, a leader. He held no rank that gave him authority over other men. But leadership, in the informal economy of a unit's daily life, is not conferred by institutional structure. It is earned through the quality of a person's judgment, the consistency of their character, and the willingness of the people around them to follow when the person chooses to act. Small had those qualities, and the men around him knew it, and when the crisis came, it was his name they invoked, and his example they followed. On the night of July 17th, Small's division had come off their shift several hours before the explosion. They were in the barracks when the docks disappeared. The blast wave hit the barracks and took out windows and flung men from their bunks. Small was on the top bunk, and he gripped the edge of the mattress as the force of the explosion rolled him, and the mattress landed on top of him and shielded him from the glass and debris that filled the air. He emerged from the barracks uncut, a fact he attributed to the specific geometry of how he had been positioned at the moment of detonation. 200 black ammunition handlers died on those docks that night. They died because they had been ordered to do dangerous work without adequate training, under competitive pressure that prioritized speed over safety, at a facility where the institutional knowledge of how to handle the materials safely had not been transferred to the men doing the handling. They died because the system had put them there and kept them there despite their protests, and kept them there because they were black servicemen in an armed forces that treated black servicemen as expendable support labor rather than as sailors whose safety warranted the same institutional investment as the safety of white sailors. In the days after the explosion, the surviving men at Port Chicago were transferred to another ammunition depot at Mare Island, near Vallejo. They had been through something that no institutional framework in existence had prepared them for. They had watched their fellow sailors die in numbers that exceeded the casualty counts of many combat engagements. They had survived not through any exercise of skill or training, but through the accident of which shift had been on the dock when the ships blew. They were, in the immediate aftermath, people who had survived something that their minds had not yet processed and whose implications they had not yet fully confronted. The Navy, characteristically, did not pause to consider what those implications might be. Within days, orders came through for the surviving men to resume ammunition loading. They were told to muster. They were marched toward the docks. And when the order came to column left toward the loading area, approximately 240 men stopped. They stopped together. No signal had been given. No one had organized the stopping in any explicit way. But the men who had been loading ammunition at Port Chicago before July 17th, who had raised concerns about safety before July 17th, who had watched 200 of their fellow sailors die on July 17th, did not, when ordered to return to the same work at another facility, continue marching. The lieutenant commanding the muster called Small to the front. He asked him directly, would he return to duty? Small said no. From somewhere in the ranks behind him, a voice said that if Small wasn't going, they weren't either. The statement was not a plan. It was an articulation of the fact that the men behind Small trusted his judgment, had been watching him operate in the informal leadership role he occupied, and were prepared to follow his example even when that example led toward a court-martial. The Navy charged 50 of the men, those it identified as most central to the refusal, with mutiny. The word mutiny has a specific legal meaning in military law. It means collective disobedience, a concerted refusal of orders, an action that threatens the command structure itself. The charge carried, under the Articles of War, a potential sentence of death. The men were held on a barge in conditions that were deliberately restrictive, marched under Marine Guard to meals and back, denied the basic dignities that the routine of military life normally provided. They were being sent a message about the institutional consequences of collective resistance, and the message was not subtle. Small, in his account of those weeks, described his role as mediator, keeping the men calm, discouraging the provocations that would have given the guards additional justification for force, thinking strategically about the position they were in. He said to the men, with the informal rhetorical authority that the situation had conferred on him, that they needed to play it carefully. He used an expression to the effect that they were in a position of leverage, that the Navy needed to be careful about how it handled 50 black sailors who had refused to load ammunition after 200 black sailors had died loading ammunition at a facility where the Navy's own safety practices had been negligent. He said this in a meeting. The Navy had a spy in the meeting. The spy's report became evidence at the court-martial, and the expression Small had used, the assertion of leverage, the claim that their position had strength, was presented as evidence of his role as a mutineer, organizing resistance. Thurgood Marshall observed the trial on behalf of the NAACP. He was not the defense attorney. The men had Navy-appointed defense lawyers, but he attended as an institutional observer, monitoring a proceeding that the NAACP had identified as a test case for the question of whether black servicemen could receive equal justice under military law. His assessment, which he later made public, was that the trial was not a genuine inquiry into the facts. It was a demonstration of institutional authority, a performance of military discipline designed to establish that the refusal of 50 black sailors to return to dangerous duty could not be permitted to stand, regardless of the circumstances that had produced it. The men were convicted. They received sentences of 8 to 15 years of hard labor with dishonorable discharges. The severity of the sentences reflected the institutional calculation that the example of 50 men successfully refusing ammunition loading would undermine the entire system by which black servicemen were concentrated in hazardous support roles, that if the men at Mare Island could refuse and face only proportionate consequences, the men at 100 other facilities across the war effort would understand that refusal was possible. The sentences were reduced after the war's end, in part because of the sustained public pressure mounted by the NAACP, the black press, and civil rights organizations that had followed the case from the beginning. The dishonorable discharges were commuted to discharges under honorable conditions, a legal category that preserved some of the technical form of honor while stripping the men of the veterans' benefits that an honorable discharge would have conferred. They could not use the GI Bill. They could not receive medical care through the VA. The discharge they had been given was calibrated to be just enough to quiet the public outcry while still denying them what they had earned. The Port Chicago case did not end segregation in the military. That would come in 1948, when President Truman's Executive Order 9981 formally desegregated the armed forces, an order whose implementation was slow and contested, and whose full effects were not felt for years. But the Port Chicago case was part of the accumulation of evidence that the segregated military was producing injustices that were becoming impossible to defend publicly. It was part of the context in which the argument for desegregation was made and eventually won. There is a broader frame in which the Port Chicago story belongs, and it connects to a question that the war itself forced into the open about the nature of American democracy. Black Americans had fought in every American war. They had served in the Civil War in numbers sufficient to affect the outcome. They had served in the First World War in the segregated units that were assigned the hardest and most dangerous tasks. They had served in the Second World War in every theater, on every ocean, in conditions that ranged from the mundane to the heroic. They had done this in an armed forces that officially classified them as inferior, in a country that officially classified them as second-class citizens in most of the states where they lived, in pursuit of a war that was publicly understood as a war for freedom and democracy. The cognitive dissonance of this situation was not a discovery of the war years. The contradiction between American democratic ideals and the specific social arrangements of American life had been identified and named for generations before 1941. But the war gave the contradiction a new and more urgent form. It was difficult to mobilize Black Americans in support of a war for freedom without implicitly engaging with the question of whose freedom was being defended, and whether the freedom being defended abroad was available to the people being asked to defend it. The men of Port Chicago occupied a particular position within this larger contradiction. They had been placed in danger through negligence and institutional indifference. They had tried to raise the issue through legitimate channels and had been ignored. They had watched their fellow sailors die, and when they were ordered back to the same work, they stopped. Their stopping was not a political act in the sense of being organized around an explicit political argument. It was a human act, the refusal of people who had been pushed past the point at which the authority being invoked over them had any remaining moral weight. Small, in the years after the war, built a life in New Jersey. He became a carpenter, an electrician, a plumber, a painter. a man of varied practical skills who worked with his hands and raised his sons and drove a church bus and was baptized in 1968 and described himself as saved. He said he held no grudge against the Navy. He said he considered what he had been through an experience worth having had. He said that if he had consented when the lieutenant asked him on that parade ground, he would have been betraying himself. He spoke with the specific equanimity of someone who had made a hard decision in a hard moment and had lived with it long enough to understand that the decision had been right. His sons knew the story. They went into the Navy themselves. They came out with honorable discharges in an integrated Navy, in a branch of service that bore almost no institutional resemblance to the one their father had been part of in 1944. The transformation between those two navies, between the Navy that put black sailors in dangerous work without adequate training and tried 50 of them for mutiny when they refused to continue, and the Navy his sons served in, was one of the significant institutional changes of the post-war decades. It was also incomplete. The specific injustices of Port Chicago, the inadequate training, the competitive pressure, the negligent safety practices, the disparate application of military discipline were eventually acknowledged. The sentences were commuted. The base was integrated. The inequities that the explosion had exposed were addressed at Port Chicago in the specific form they had taken there. The broader systems that had produced those inequities were slower to change and in some forms remained contested. The question that Port Chicago posed, whether Black Americans could expect equal protection, equal dignity, and equal safety from the institutions they served, did not have a complete answer in 1944, and the history of the subsequent decades is in part a record of how that question has been variously answered, contested, and partially resolved. Small said, when asked what would have happened if he had said yes instead of no on that parade ground, that he would have been betraying himself. The statement is simple and it contains everything. A man knows what he has been through. A man knows what was owed to the 200 who died on those docks. A man knows what his answer means when an institution that has already demonstrated its indifference to his life asks him to return to the work it killed his fellow sailors doing. He said no. The 50 men behind him stopped. And the record of what they did and why, and what it cost them and what it eventually produced, is part of the history of this country's long contested, unfinished process of becoming what it declared itself to be.